Rohingya refugees in India can breathe a sigh of relief for now. The Supreme Court has asked the government to strike a balance between national security and human rights. The court said that the government shouldn't deport the Rohingya, but it also didn't pass a formal order placing any sort of restrictions either. It asked the petitioners instead to approach the court in case the government begins a deportation exercise. The next date of the hearing has been set for November 21st. The court observed that the Rohingyas' human rights can't be ignored. It added that if the centre decided to put a contingency plan in place, it needed to keep the court informed. Now, India is home to an estimated 40,000 Rohingya refugees. The Indian government says that many of them have links to ISIS and Pakistan's spy agency ISI. Additionally, the centre is concerned about the impact their continued presence would have on India's natural resources. Despite its concerns, though, India's stance has received widespread criticism, including from the UN's human rights chief. The issue has received increased attention on account of the crisis in Myanmar that has seen millions of Rohingya fleeing into Bangladesh, sparking a humanitarian crisis. Joining me on the broadcast tonight to talk more about that story is India's former Foreign Secretary, Mr. Kamal Sibal. Good evening, Mr. Sibal. Thanks so much for joining us here on WION. Appreciate you taking out the time. What do you make of this directive?
Well, it's a bit confusing. Of course, the Supreme Court was faced with a difficult situation because humanitarian law cannot be ignored by the highest court of the land. And yet the fact is that these Rohingyas have entered India illegally. They are illegal migrants. And there are many who amongst them have terrorist links and proven terrorist links. In fact, the ASRA, which has been operating in Myanmar and attacking police and military posts, has an avowed agenda of militancy and even jihadism. And they have great support from Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and the ISI. So these are realities on the ground. So I wish the Supreme Court had not tried to tie the hands of the government, and when the next hearing takes place on November 23 or whenever, they should give the discretion to the government to act in the best interest of the country. In any case, the Supreme Court should realize, and public opinion in India should realize, that even if the government wants to deport them, this cannot be done tomorrow or day after, or in fact in the foreseeable future, because deportation will have to be ultimately to Myanmar or Bangladesh from where they have come. But Myanmar and Bangladesh are already in discussion, as Aung San Suu Kyi has indicated. They are willing to consider genuine cases of people who have been thrown out of Myanmar for their return. But this is going to be a long drawn out process, and in this process India cannot intervene by sending people back to Bangladesh or try to send them back to Myanmar. And I must also mention that there is this whole problem of 20 million of illegal Bangladeshis in this country.
Right.
Now, if Bangladesh was to accept deportees from India, they would weaken their own case with regard to those 20 million illegal immigrants whom they don't want to accept. And similarly, if Myanmar were to accept deportees, then their case will be weakened with Bangladesh because they want to have a joint exercise to determine who are genuine refugees. And the other thing that is very worrisome is the places in India where they have settled down.
Yes.
Whether it's in Jammu or Samba, and I'm told even in Ladakh or in Hyderabad. Now, why have they settled down there? They've got identity cards, they've got voter cards, they've got electricity connections. Which are the organizations and groups who are helping them to settle? And finally, they didn't come to India seeking asylum. They just entered India illegally, clandestinely, trying to pass off as Indian citizens, and then now seeking the shelter of Indian laws. Now, you know, the US Supreme Court finally gave President Trump the possibility of imposing a temporary ban of entry of Muslims from 7 states, Muslim states. You know, we've not gone that far in terms of our view about whether we should, our relations with the Islamic world and those countries which are infested with terrorism. We are far more liberal. Even the US Supreme Court has given some leeway.
Allow me to come in, sir. You did mention the fact that there was a degree of confusion given today's directive by the Supreme Court. Keeping that in mind, what do you see as the likely outcome in terms of how exactly the government is going to tread that middle path of humanity versus security?
Well, look, as I said, there is not going to be any deportation. What is very important is that the principle of deportation should be accepted by the country and by the courts. That those who enter India illegally can be deported, must be deported. The timing of that will take place in accordance with circumstances that one has to contend with, because there are external elements that are involved in this, not simply a decision to be taken by India. After all, they have to be deported to another country, and another country must be willing to accept them. And then in any case, even in the best of circumstances for the Indian government, those who are poor or ill or ailing or etc., they are not likely to be deported. After all, we are a liberal democracy, and there are humanitarian issues involved which government recognizes. But I don't think the Supreme Court should tie down the hands of the executive. The executive should be allowed to deal with this, keeping in mind that the government itself is conscious of its responsibilities as a liberal democracy.
All right, stay with me, Mr. Sibal. Mr. Manish Mohan, the advocate with the Supreme Court, is also joining us live on the broadcast. Mr. Mohan, thanks very much for speaking with us. We were discussing this directive from the Supreme Court vis-a-vis the Rohingya refugees in India. What are the legal implications of this directive, given that it has not passed any sort of formal restrictions on the government in how it needs to conduct the deportation process, if you will?
See, as of now, the legal issues relating to this entire issue are yet to be discussed. Right now, what it has become is a religious, a social, and various kinds of issues without having the legal implications. Therefore, today the Honorable Supreme Court has very rightly said that we will discuss it after insulating it from all other issues and purely on the legal standpoint.
Do you feel, sir, that has something to do with the way public opinion, not just in India but elsewhere, split on the Rohingya issue, given the sort of images that we're looking at of the exodus of the Rohingya from Myanmar into Bangladesh?
See, all the relevant facts will be taken into consideration, but generally the court's verdict are not based on public opinions, because that will go haywire. So ultimately the court will consider all the relevant issues based on a very insulated atmosphere and a very balanced atmosphere, and not on these considerations which are being projected and portrayed right now.
All right, stay with me, sir. Mr. Sibal, if I can ask you, not just public opinion, it seems even world opinion is split on the Rohingya crisis. We've seen Turkey and other countries step in to help Bangladesh in dealing with the influx of refugees. Also, India has received a certain amount of flack from, for instance, United Nations Human Rights Chief, that says the process that India is following is incorrect. What do you make of that split, sir?
Well, we should ignore the UN HCR chief because he speaks too much. He's how should I say, he makes statements which are uncalled for, and he doesn't think through, and he's been troublesome for us, and I'm saying that quite frankly. And he belongs to a country which has no liberal tradition. He's a prince from Jordan. I don't know how much Jordan knows about human rights and how much this gentleman has been involved in a serious commitment to the issue of human rights. They should look at their own country. And so far as Turkey is concerned, look at the politics they've been playing with refugees. They have been extracting concessions from the European Union by saying that you allow visa-free entry for Turks, as also give them $3-4 billion, and they got $3 billion. Otherwise, they'll open the floodgate of refugees from Turkey and let them enter Europe. Now, this is the kind of approach they have to the refugee problem. And look at what's happening in Europe. Slovakia, Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, they refuse to accept any refugees. And Hungary said that they will accept only Christian refugees from Syria, but not Muslim refugees, because Islam is alien to European civilization. We have not gone that far at all, not at all, not at all. And if you see all these miserable images of Rohingyas fleeing from Myanmar, it's not our doing. We have nothing to do with it. These chaps have not entered the country as refugees seeking succor. They have entered as illegal immigrants. That point has to be accepted. And finally, I think that the Supreme Court, as I mentioned earlier, should not take a view that limits the executive from taking proper action, because if this happens, then I'm afraid we will not be able to deal not only with the 20 million Bangladeshi refugees who are here, but refugees who come from anywhere, because they will know that they have the shelter of Indian law and the Indian government cannot deport them. So we'll be buying serious trouble for ourselves in the future if the Supreme Court gave that kind of a directive, and I hope they don't do that. But I do agree that the government, at the end of the day, while they have the right to deport, they should also take into account humanitarian conditions of individuals who are not in a position to be deported.
So I didn't want to stray from today's directive, but your last answer forces me to ask you this question. Do you feel it's fair to say that countries like India end up getting the short end of the stick when we're talking about what the West perceives as human rights and humanitarian grounds?
Of course. I mean, you know, we have not intervened in Myanmar. We have not done regime change in Myanmar. We are not responsible for a breakdown of Myanmar society which has caused the refugees. And the people who have done this in the Middle East, where all the societies have been destabilized and the refugee flows have created an enormous problem for these societies. And these are liberal societies, democratic societies, who actually are the ones who framed these refugee laws. They are the ones who were responsible for the Refugee Convention and everything else. But look at the problem they are facing. And they are now giving us lessons. But why should they give us lessons? And I agree with you that, well, short stick or not, we shouldn't bother about that. But we should do what is right in light of our own laws, in light of our own security situation, in light of our own interests, and in consonance with the liberal democracy that we have, which does not accept that people coming from outside should create a national security problem for India. Already the country is facing huge problem of terrorism, and we don't need to add to this. And finally, I think we are wrong in using the word Rohingyas, because the Myanmar government doesn't accept this term.
Fair enough.
And they accepted the Kofi Annan mission on condition that the word Rohingyas would not be mentioned, because Rohingyas actually mean spiritualists or warriors. So you can see what the Rohingyas stand for as a group, and there's a problem there.
All right, Mr. Mohan, I have time for one last question. Mr. Sibal mentioned, of course, the fact that many of these Rohingya refugees living in India actually have access to Aadhaar cards. They've got papers to prove that they're residents, but they never really came into the country seeking refugee status. Does that sort of complicate the matter a bit further?
Exactly. That is what I meant initially. See, basically it's a subject matter of needful government or executive action. Whatever action the government or the executive takes based on security consideration, the exigencies of the nation and the citizens of India, that will be subjected to the strict legal screening in court under a very insulated atmosphere.
Okay.
Now the government action cannot be based on just these considerations, like somebody already has an Aadhaar card or a voter ID card when he is admittedly not a citizen of India and he is wanting shelter in India. So all these illegal, all these things which they have come to own illegally cannot be a subject matter for granting them as a matter of right.
Sure. Fair enough. We leave it at that, gentlemen. Mr. Kanwal Sibal and Mr. Manish Mohan, thank you both for joining us this evening on WION and sharing your perspective with us on that story. Appreciate you doing that. We'll, of course, keep track of the Supreme Court's judgment, which is now going to come out on November 21st.